this door, Mr. Rourke, if you mean to let my boy die. At least look him in the face while you do it.
My God, get inside.
Help him, please!
By the time Elias Rourke got the bar off the door, snow had already shouldered halfway into the cabin. The woman on the threshold did not wait for permission. She staggered across the sill in a whirl of white, clutching a bundled child so tightly the blanket had frozen stiff along one edge. Elias slammed the door with both hands, dropped the wooden bar back into place, and turned to find her standing in the middle of his floorboards like a creature blown in from another world, hat gone, lashes clotted with ice, mouth bloodless from cold. The child made a thin, rasping cry that sounded weaker than the wind outside. That frightened him more than the sight of the storm. He had lived alone at the line cabin above Bridger Pass long enough to know what winter took when it meant to take it. And he knew the look of a body running out of warmth. "Get him out of those wet things," he said, already moving for the stove. "Not by the fire. Slow. If you scorch him, you'll do worse than the cold." The woman nodded once, hard and fast, as if she had no spare breath for gratitude, and sank to her knees beside the hearth. Elias knelt opposite her and reached for the baby with the kind of caution one used around live coals or loaded pistols. The little fellow could not have been more than 9 months old. His cheeks were blotched an alarming purple red, his lashes wet, his lips tinged blue at the center. The woman's fingers shook as she unwound the blanket, but there was nothing helpless in the way she worked. She stripped the wet outer layers quickly, rubbed the child's back through a dry flannel Elias thrust at her, and tucked him against her own chest beneath her shawl, while Elias pulled 2 flat stones from the stove edge and wrapped them in cloth. "Name?" he asked. "The boy's." "Noah," she said, lifting her chin without looking up. "And if you have any milk, I'll need it warmed, not boiled." Elias passed her the stones, noting the firmness in her voice. Most people who stumbled into his cabin during bad weather either begged or babbled. This woman issued directions like a person accustomed to being obeyed when it mattered. He crossed to the shelf above the washstand, took down the small tin of condensed milk he kept for coffee on long storms, and felt her eyes follow the movement. "You'll get it," he said. "So will he, if the cold hasn't gone too deep." The cabin stood 12 miles west of Hart's Crossing and 5 hard miles below the highest throat of Bridger Pass, where the road vanished under snow often enough that the county paid Elias to keep this place, tend the signal poles, clear what drifts he could, and watch the telegraph spur that ran down toward town. It was not much of a life by most standards. 1 square room, a loft for storage, a lean-to stable, a table scarred by knives and ink, and a narrow bunk built against the far wall. But it was warm when the stove held, dry when the chinking behaved, and quiet in the way. Only lonely places were quiet, with every sound sharpened into importance. Elias had chosen it for that very reason. Up here no one expected charm from him, and fewer still asked about the year he stopped building bridges and began repairing weather damage for a county board that preferred a man with no family to distract him. Now the quiet had been broken by a woman with storm in her hair and a child who sounded as though his little chest were full of paper. Elias set a dented pan on the stove, poured in water and milk, and listened to Noah's breathing with the old ache beginning under his ribs. The one that usually meant memory was on its way. When the milk was warm enough, the woman fed the baby from a rubber-tipped bottle she drew from her valise, handling the thing with the weary precision of long practice. Noah fussed at first, then latched on greedily. Some color crept back into his face. Elias watched the rise and fall of the child's chest, counting without meaning to. The woman must have noticed, because after a moment she said, "He's had the cough for 3 days, but it worsened after dusk. I kept him dry as long as I could." Her voice had deepened now that she was no longer shouting into a storm. It carried education, and not the fancy kind either. It was the clear, spare sound of someone used to giving information plainly because time was often short. "How long were you out there?" Elias asked. She flexed her hands near the stove, wincing as feeling returned. "Long enough to learn the difference between bad luck and foolishness." Our driver turned the wagon toward a section house south of the grade. By morning the roof had gone. Another day there and the snow would have buried the door. "I found your cabin by following the line posts between gusts." Elias stared at her. Most men lost the poles in fair weather when the light went flat. She met his stare with the steady irritation of a woman too tired to care whether a stranger approved of her choices. He handed her a mug of coffee, then took one for himself and sat across from her at the table, keeping the lamp between them. Up close he saw she was older than he first thought, not a frightened girl but a woman in her early 30s with an angular face weathered by travel. A split in one glove mended so neatly it almost passed for factory work, and a stubborn set to the mouth that suggested trouble did not easily push her where it pleased. She had a leather valise, a bundled parcel tied with telegraph twine, and a narrow wooden case no ordinary traveler would bother carrying through winter. "Where were you trying to get to?" he asked. "Hart's Crossing," she said. "To the telegraph office." That made him glance toward the wall where his sounder sat on a shelf, silent for the moment except for the faint metallic twitch bad storms sometimes teased from the line. "You and half the county," he said. "Why?" "Because if I don't report there before the week is out, the office won't reopen in time for the federal inspection at month's end." She took one measured sip of coffee. "And if that inspection fails, Hart's Crossing loses its winter mail contract." Elias said nothing at first. That contract meant freight, medicine, payroll packets, newspapers, replacement parts, nearly the whole thin braid, tying the settlement to the rest of Wyoming. The woman saw from his expression that he understood. "My name is Clara Bellamy," she said. "I was hired to take over the key." The silence that followed was broken by 3 weak clicks from the sounder behind Elias's shoulder. Clara's head turned before his did. Another 4 clicks came, irregular and muddy, as though the storm itself were speaking through tin. Elias half rose, but Clara was already on her feet with Noah against her shoulder. "That relay screw is misseated," she said, nodding at the instrument. "Has been for some time if that buzz on the downstroke is honest." Elias stared at her, then moved aside more from surprise than courtesy. She crossed to the shelf, shifted the baby to one arm, and with her free hand opened the narrow wooden case. Inside lay a key, a small screwdriver, a strip of emery cloth, and a vial of something dark for cleaning contacts. She worked quickly, touching the instrument as if it were as familiar as a washboard. "You run telegraph often?" Elias asked. 7 years, she said. "Rawlins first. Then Evanston. Then a mining spur near Green River where the men cursed in 3 languages and still sent worse spelling than schoolboys." One corner of her mouth almost lifted, though the expression was gone before it settled. She tightened the screw, cleaned the contact point, and nodded toward the shelf. "Now sit. See if the line still has breath." Elias lowered himself onto the stool and listened. The clicks came again, weak, but decipherable now. He caught only fragments, but Clara, standing beside him, repeated them aloud under her breath. "Battery failing. Drift over East Road. Doctor delayed. Holding for operator." Then she looked at him. "They're waiting." Noah coughed, a raw little bark that tore through the room. Clara went back to him at once, but Elias noticed what she did next. She did not coo, nor cry, nor collapse into panic. She loosened the child's wraps, tilted him forward, listened to his breathing with her ear against his back, and then asked Elias if he had onions, goose grease, or clean wool. He had onions and clean wool. She sliced the onion thin, warmed it near the stove, and made a crude poultice beneath the child's shirt while explaining in the same plain tone, "It won't cure anything. It may ease his chest until I can get him seen by a doctor." Elias watched her hands. They were red and swollen from the cold, but never clumsy. "His father in Hart's Crossing?" he asked, more to fill the room than from right. Clara kept her gaze on the child. "No." She tied the cloth closed and lifted Noah until he settled. "His mother was my sister." That answer sat between them a moment. Elias looked at the baby again, then back at her face. "And the father?" Clara's jaw hardened by a degree. "Buried outside Cheyenne in October." She met his eyes then, not defensive so much as final. "He's mine now. That is sufficient for any road between here and town." Elias inclined his head once. He had asked. She had answered. There was no meanness in her refusal to give more, only boundary. He respected that more than he would have respected tears. Wind struck the cabin broadside hard enough to rattle the lamp glass. A moment later, something banged outside from the lean-to stable, followed by the frantic thump of a mule kicking timber. Elias was on his feet instantly. "Stay with the boy." He dragged on his coat and reached for the latch, but Clara's voice stopped him. "If that's your roof flap coming loose, don't fight it from the top. Anchor the lee side first." He looked back. She had risen with Noah against one shoulder and was pointing toward a coil of trace chain near the hearth. "Use that through the lower eyelets. If you lose the bottom edge..." The whole sheet will peel. Elias almost asked how she knew, then remembered the section house with the gone roof and saved the question. He grabbed the chain, plunged outside, and vanished into the white. The cold struck like a board. Snow blew sideways so thick the stable lamp was only a yellow smear. Clara had been right. One corner of the canvas windbreak over the lean-to had ripped free, and each snapping gust threatened to strip the whole thing away. Elias dropped to one knee, ran the chain through the eyelets, and lashed it under the sled runner braced against the wall. The mule settled once the canvas stopped flailing. When he pushed back into the cabin 10 minutes later, beard rhymed with ice. Clara had moved his coffee off the stove before it boiled over, and had found the wool socks he forgot by the hearth, laying them where he could change fast. That simple act unsettled him more than the storm. People did not usually step into his cabin and begin reading its habits correctly within the hour. He changed his socks by the stove while Clara, now seated again, bounced Noah gently and kept one eye on the sounder. "Hart's Crossing expects you?" he asked. "Mr. Pritchard, the postmaster, does," she said. He wrote after the last operator's wife left for Laramie. He wanted someone who could manage the key, the books, and the money orders without losing her head every time weather cut the line. She looked at the battered instrument and then at him. "I accepted because I need wages, and because a town that loses its office loses more than mail. It loses the habit of being considered." Elias absorbed that. He had seen towns vanish one closed service at a time, the blacksmith gone, then the freight stop, then the doctor riding elsewhere. "You drag a baby into mountain weather for a clerk's salary?" he said, not unkindly, just blunt. Clara's expression did not change. "I drag a child toward a future that includes regular pay, a stove paid for with my own money, and a room no landlord can take back, because a man died and left me no proper name to trade on." She glanced down at Noah. "I have done easier things for smaller reasons." The line clicked again, sharper now, then stuttered into silence so abruptly the stillness rang. Elias crossed to the window, rubbed a patch clear with his sleeve, and saw what he had half expected. One of the nearest line poles canted farther than it had an hour earlier, its top swallowed in streaming snow. If that pole went, the whole pass section would lie dead until the weather broke and a man could reach it. "Damn," he said quietly. Clara came to stand beside him. Even through the frost-crusted glass they could see almost nothing beyond the whitening yard and the black shadow of the woodpile. "How far to town by road?" she asked. 12 miles if you keep the track," Elias said. "More if the drifts force you into the flats. And by line of sight from ridge to ridge." "What kind of question is that?" "The kind a telegraph operator asks when she needs to know whether a message post might be improvised, or whether a sled can cut a straighter course than a wagon." Elias looked at her fully then. Beneath exhaustion, beneath cold, beneath whatever grief had already shaped her life into this hard-edged form, Clara Bellamy was still planning. She was in his cabin less than 2 hours and already sorting routes, assets, and failures like pieces on a chessboard. "You're not thinking of leaving tonight," he said. "No," she answered. "I'm thinking of mourning." The honesty of it hit him harder than any plea would have. He went to the cupboard and took stock because counting was how a man kept fear from becoming superstition. Flour for 6 days if stretched, beans for 8, salt pork enough for a week, lamp oil not abundant, firewood decent if the drift had not soaked the lower row, feed for the mule, 4 days, maybe 5. He could keep them here until the storm eased properly, but every day lost bit into more than food. If Hart's Crossing's office stayed closed, the inspection would fail. If the office failed, the mail route would shift east to a larger stop. If the mail route shifted, half the winter trade in town went with it. Clara would lose the job she had crossed the territory to claim, and if Noah's cough deepened into the lungs, waiting on weather might kill him as surely as travel. Elias hated choices that came dressed as arithmetic. Too many numbers in his life had ended with bodies. He stood with one hand on the cupboard door and felt the brass compass in his pocket press against his palm. The old one that had belonged to his younger brother, Jonah, back when they still believed roads could be made safe through stubbornness alone. He took the compass out and set it on the table without opening it. Clara's eyes dropped to it, then rose to his face, but she asked nothing. That, too, he respected. Near midnight the wind shifted from a scream to a lower, grinding moan. Not mercy, but change. Elias opened the door a crack and studied the swirl by lantern light. The snow still drove hard, though not as wild. He shut the door again and found Clara half asleep in the chair, Noah bundled on her chest, one hand resting protectively over the child's back. The sight struck him with a force he had no patience for. Not tenderness exactly. Recognition, perhaps, of strain borne quietly, of duty carried without witness. He fed 2 more sticks into the stove and said, "If the gusts drop at first light, there's a way across the willow flats that keeps off the steep road. I've got a freight sled. It rides low and steady if the crust holds." Clara was awake at once. "You'd take us?" He nodded once. "I'd take you to Hart's Crossing, repair whatever stretch of line I can reach near town, and get that office open if the place still stands where folks left it." He looked at Noah, then back at her. "But we leave only if the weather gives 1 honest hour. You do exactly as I say on the trail. No heroics, no arguments, because a town clerk thinks she knows wind better than I do." Clara's mouth almost bent into a tired smile. "That depends," she said softly. "Does a mountain man know telegraph better than I do?" Elias snorted despite himself. "Likely not." Then he opened the brass compass, listened to its tiny lid click in the warm room, and made the choice he had spent 7 years avoiding. "Good," he said. "Then at dawn we travel as partners." Dawn arrived without sunrise. The eastern sky merely changed from black to a dim gray that made the snowdrifts outside Elias Rourke's cabin look like frozen waves. He woke before Clara, though he doubted she had truly slept. She sat slumped in the chair beside the stove, one arm around Noah and the other tucked beneath her coat for warmth. The boy's breathing still rasped, but the blue had left his lips. Elias checked the thermometer nailed beside the door, 12 below zero. The wind had dropped enough to hear the mule shifting in the lean-to. That mattered. He opened the door 6 inches and watched loose snow skim low across the yard instead of flying head high. "We have our hour," he said. Clara opened her eyes immediately. No confusion, no complaint. She touched Noah's forehead, listened to his chest, and stood. "Tell me what to carry." Elias liked that answer. He handed her a small canvas sack. "Milk, blankets, your telegraph tools, nothing you can't lose. Everything else stays." Clara glanced at her leather valise, hesitated only once, then removed a folded packet of papers and slipped them inside her coat. "Everything else stays," she agreed. The freight sled was built for mail sacks, not passengers. Elias had constructed it 2 winters earlier, from ash runners, oak crosspieces, and a low box bed that could travel over crusted snow without tipping as easily as a wagon. He spread hay across the bottom, laid 2 wool blankets over it, then made a narrow windbreak from canvas and spare boards around the place where Clara would sit with Noah. She watched him test the runner bolts twice. "You don't trust your own work?" she asked. "I trust wood to behave like wood," Elias said. "That means I check it." She considered that while fastening Noah inside her coat beneath a second shawl. Telegraph lines behave much the same. People blame electricity, when half the trouble is loose brass and wet insulation. Elias gave her a sidelong glance. "You always compare men's equipment to your own trade?" "Only when they are proud of it." For the first time he heard unmistakable humor in her voice. It surprised a laugh out of him, short and rusty from disuse. The sound made Clara glance up, and for one strange second the morning seemed less cold. Then the mule stamped, reminding them both that weather did not care whether strangers had begun to understand each other. They left shortly after 7. Elias walking beside the mule with the reins looped through one gloved hand. The road to Hart's Crossing disappeared within a 1/4 mile, swallowed by drifts taller than the fence posts, so he turned south toward the willow flats. The surface there was deceptive. Wind had hardened the top crust overnight, but beneath it lay loose powder deep enough to trap a runner if they struck a hollow. Elias used a 6-foot ash pole to test uncertain stretches before leading the mule across. Clara did not question every turn as he had half expected. Instead, she watched the line poles. Every few minutes she counted under her breath, then looked toward the terrain ahead. "Pole 23 should be near that rise," she called. "If your spacing is regular." "It isn't," Elias answered. "County crews set them wherever the ground allowed. That is why I said should." He looked back. She was studying the landscape the way he studied a bridge frame, searching for pattern, expecting error. 20 minutes later she pointed left. There, a dark pole tip showed through the blowing snow, farther from the road than he expected. Elias changed course toward it. Clara had just corrected the man who supposedly knew the pass. At the next pole they found the first break. The cedar shaft had not snapped, but its upper brace had twisted under ice load, dragging the wire low enough that it hummed in the wind barely 10 feet above the snow. Elias tied the mule to a willow and told Clara they would lose 15 minutes. "Closer to 30 if you climb it," she said. "Don't." He frowned. "Wire won't fix itself. It doesn't need to be fixed properly. It needs to carry current until we reach town." She climbed from the sled, keeping Noah strapped beneath her coat, and opened her tool case. From it, she produced a short coil of insulated copper wire, then pointed to the sagging span. "If the break is at the binding, we can bypass the bad joint from the ground. You lift the line with that pole. I'll make the temporary connection." Elias started to object because the words, temporary connection, sounded too close to foolishness in mountain weather. Clara cut him off. "You asked me to follow you on the trail. This is not the trail. This is my line." He stared at her for a heartbeat, then handed over the authority as deliberately as he would have handed over a loaded rifle. "Tell me where to stand." Her repair took 11 minutes. Elias lifted the sagging wire using the forked end of his ash pole while Clara scraped corrosion from an exposed section, looped her copper bypass around the damaged joint, and insulated it with waxed cloth from her kit. Her fingers worked more slowly in the cold, but they never wandered. When she finished, she tapped the line gently and listened to its faint metallic vibration. It might hold a day, maybe 2. Elias lowered the pole. Enough for inspection messages. Enough for someone to complain about the weather in Denver. She packed her tools and climbed back into the sled, but Elias noticed her right hand had begun to shake. "Give me that. I'm fine." "No. You're useful, which means I prefer your fingers attached." He took her glove, warmed it beneath his coat for half a minute, then returned it without ceremony. Clara said nothing. She only pulled it on and tucked her hand around Noah. Yet something had shifted between them. Elias had accepted her judgment without sulking, and Clara had accepted help without turning it into defeat. Neither named the change. The mule leaned into the traces, and the sled moved on. The flats ended at a frozen creek crossing where Elias expected trouble and found worse. The early winter ice had buckled beneath the weight of new snow, leaving a raised ridge 3 feet high across the route. Going around would force them toward a shallow ravine where wind piled snow deepest. Elias studied the ridge, then began packing snow against it with his shovel to form a ramp. Clara watched for several minutes before asking, "How much weight will that hold?" "Enough." That was not a number. He stopped shoveling. "You want arithmetic now? I want Noah not overturned into a creek." Elias drove the shovel down harder than necessary. "I've hauled freight here before. Before this ice heaved. That landed where she meant it to." Elias glanced at the ridge again. He had been treating an old crossing like the same crossing because he knew the ground beneath it. Clara had no such comfort. She saw only present conditions. He walked the ramp, drove the testing pole through the packed edge, and found hollow space beneath the snow. The first plan would not hold. He exhaled through his teeth. "You're right." Clara did not smile. "What do we do instead?" It was the right question. They unloaded the sled and carried the supplies across by hand. Elias then unhitched the mule, led it over separately, and rigged a rope through 2 willows, so they could drag the empty sled sideways across the strongest part of the ice ridge, instead of climbing it head-on. The maneuver cost 40 minutes and nearly a sack of flour when the sled slipped, but it worked. Once everything was repacked, Elias checked the sky. Their honest hour was already gone. Snow thickened from the west, soft at first, then steady. "We should turn back," he said. Clara's face tightened, but she nodded instead of arguing. That surprised him enough that he added, "There's a line shelter 3 miles ahead, smaller than my cabin, but closer than going back if we can make it before this builds. Can Noah be kept warm there? If the stovepipe isn't blocked, then we go forward." Elias studied her. She had not insisted because of pride or employment. Every calculation began with the child. He understood that kind of hierarchy. There were things a person feared losing so completely that every other decision arranged itself beneath them. He took Jonah's brass compass from his pocket, checked the bearing despite knowing the route, and returned it carefully. Clara noticed again. Again, she did not ask. The line shelter appeared near noon as a dark square half buried beneath drifted snow. It had been built for repair crews. 1 room, 1 iron stove, a cot frame, a shelf, and a box beneath the floor, where emergency coal was supposed to remain dry. Elias shoveled the entrance clear while Clara held the mule. Inside, the air smelled of cold iron and old mice. The stovepipe was clogged at the cap, exactly as Elias feared. He climbed onto the lee side of the roof with a rope around his waist while Clara anchored the other end around the base of a line pole. Halfway up, the crust broke under his left boot. He slid hard, struck his knee against the eave, and only the rope kept him from dropping into a bank deep enough to bury a man upright. "Elias!" Clara shouted. He heard the sharpness in her voice and hated that he had caused it. "I'm all right." He was not entirely. His knee throbbed, and when he tried to climb again, the joint threatened to fold. Clara ordered him down. He nearly refused from habit. Then she said, "You cannot clear a stovepipe if you break your leg, proving you can." That was difficult to argue with. They solved the problem from below. Clara found a length of thin repair rod beneath the cot while Elias removed the stove elbow. By feeding the rod upward in sections and striking the pipe with the wooden handle of his shovel, they dislodged a plug of ice and soot that fell in black chunks across the floor. 10 minutes later, smoke drew properly through the chimney. Elias lit coal, then sat on the cot to examine his knee. Nothing broken, he decided, though the swelling promised trouble. Clara crouched in front of him and pressed carefully along the joint. "You know injuries too?" he asked. "Only the common kind. Telegraph offices collect more foolish men than you'd imagine." "That sounds like an insult." "It is an observation." She wrapped his knee tightly with a strip torn from an old blanket. Her touch was efficient rather than tender, which somehow made it easier for him to allow. Noah, lying bundled near the stove, coughed twice and then began to fuss with more force than he had shown the night before. Clara stopped wrapping long enough to smile at the sound. "That is the first complaint I've been pleased to hear from him." Elias looked at the child and understood why. They ate beans warmed in a tin pan while snow covered their tracks outside. The shelter had one small window, frosted almost opaque, and a telegraph test box mounted to the wall beside it. Clara cleaned its terminals and connected her portable key. At first there was nothing. Then the sounder gave a faint pulse. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Hart's crossing," she said. Elias moved closer. Clara tapped a call sequence, waited, then sent again. This time an answer came in broken bursts. She translated aloud as she received it. "Pritchard. Office roof damaged. Doctor at McClellan Ranch. Child fever cases in town. Road east, blocked." She stopped tapping. Her expression had changed. "They have no operator?" Elias asked. "Pritchard can receive slowly. He cannot transmit well enough for official traffic." And she sent another message, her fingers precise despite fatigue. "Bellamy, safe. Child, ill. Arrive when possible. Keep battery warm. Do not dismantle key." Then she added something Elias did not catch. "What was that?" he asked. "I told him to send word to the doctor if the line east clears." She sat back. "We are not the only people waiting on weather." The afternoon trapped them at the shelter, but idleness never settled. Elias repaired the sled's loosened rear brace using a spare iron strap he found under the coal box. Clara inventoried the line supplies and discovered 6 ceramic insulators, 40 feet of copper wire, 3 dry cells, and a cracked signal lantern. Noah slept between them in a nest made from Elias's coat. Their work crossed without ceremony. Clara held the brace while Elias drilled new holes. Elias trimmed a strip of leather to replace the broken strap on her tool case. When the lantern's lower hinge refused to seat, Clara heated the pin near the stove and straightened it while Elias steadied the housing. Small competence accumulated faster than conversation. By evening they had a repaired sled, a functioning lantern, and enough emergency wire to patch 2 more breaks. Clara placed the lantern on the shelf and turned its glass chimney in her hands. "Red pane is missing," she said. "Then it's a light, not a signal." Elias reached into the parts box, found a square of red glass wrapped in newspaper, and slid it into place. Now it's both. Neither could know yet how much that small distinction would matter. After dark, the storm softened again, though neither suggested leaving. Elias sat near the door, sharpening his knife while Clara rewound copper wire into her wooden case. Noah slept with one fist curled beneath his chin. The silence between them had become different from the silence of the cabin. Less guarded, more occupied. "Why bridge work?" Clara asked suddenly. Elias's hand paused once over the whetstone. "Who said I built bridges?" "Your sled joints." Those scarf cuts aren't county repair work, and you test load before trusting a brace except when you think you know the ground too well. Elias gave her a long look. You observe too much. It keeps lines working. He returned to the blade. I built trestles with my brother. He stopped there. Clara waited but did not ask the obvious question. After a moment she said only, he taught you the compass? Elias looked toward the brass case resting beside his glove. Other way around. It was his. Clara nodded, accepting the limit he had set. For once, silence did not feel like evasion. It felt like space intentionally left untouched. Before sleep, Elias stepped outside to check the sky. The wind had weakened, and through a tear in the clouds he could see one hard star above the ridge. Clara joined him at the doorway with the repaired signal lantern in her hand, its red pane glowing against the snow. Morning? She asked. Elias listened to the pass, judged the drifting snow, then nodded. Morning. She lifted the lantern slightly, illuminating the nearest telegraph pole in crimson. The wire ran from that pole into darkness, damaged but still alive, carrying messages across miles neither of them could safely cross yet. Elias thought about the temporary joint Clara had made, about the crossing she had kept him from trusting blindly, about the stovepipe they had cleared together after his own plan failed. He had spent years believing survival meant needing less from other people. By the end of one winter day, a telegraph operator carrying a sick child had proved that sometimes survival worked the opposite way. Clara looked down at the red light and said, "Funny thing about a line. One good connection can keep a whole system alive." Elias closed the door against the cold. He did not answer. He did not need to. Morning gave them a sky the color of hammered tin and a wind that had finally lost its teeth. Elias tested his injured knee before admitting it would carry him, though Clara noticed the stiffness and said nothing. They loaded the sled in practiced silence, each taking the task the other had handled the day before. Clara secured Noah's blankets and wrapped the telegraph batteries against the cold. Elias checked the runners, harness, and repaired brace. Before they left, he took Jonah's brass compass from his pocket, opened it, and held it toward the weak light. The needle settled north. Clara stood beside him, studying the line of buried poles ahead. The road bends west beyond the ridge, she said, but the wire stays nearly southeast. Elias nodded. For 2 miles. He hesitated, then held the compass out to her. Keep us on that bearing if the poles disappear. Clara accepted the small brass instrument with a care that told him she understood the gesture was larger than the object. She did not ask about Jonah. She only folded the lid closed around the needle and tucked it inside the safest pocket of her coat. Southeast, she said. 2 miles. Then they moved into the white country together. The first mile went easily. The second reminded them why mountain weather never deserved confidence. Wind from the previous night had erased the shallow trough where the road should have been, and 2 consecutive telegraph poles lay buried almost completely. Elias wanted to angle downhill toward a cluster of cottonwoods he recognized near Miller Creek. Clara opened the compass, checked the needle, then compared it to the faint black thread of wire still visible, where it entered a drift. If we drop that far west, we'll have to climb back toward the line, she said. The mule may manage it, the sled might not. Elias studied the slope. His instincts told him the cottonwoods offered easier ground, but his knee was already reminding him that instinct had failed at the shelter roof. Your route? He asked. Clara pointed southeast across what looked like an unbroken field. There should be another pole beyond that rise. If we reach it, we stay level. Elias tested the crust with his ash staff and found firm snow underneath. Then southeast. The choice saved them nearly an hour. When the next pole emerged from the drift, exactly where Clara predicted, she handed the compass back without triumph. Elias closed it and slipped it into his pocket. You could have said I told you so. I'm saving that privilege for a more expensive mistake. Hart's Crossing announced itself first by smoke, then rooftops. The town crouched along a shallow basin where the stage road met the railroad spur. Scarcely 40 buildings gathered against a winter much larger than all of them. Snow buried porches to the railings. Men shoveled roofs with boards and grain scoops. 2 boys were digging a path between the general store and livery while an elderly woman shouted that they were throwing half of it back where they had started. Clara sat straighter when the first buildings came into view. Elias saw something loosen in her face, not relief exactly, but recognition of a place she had chosen before ever seeing it. The telegraph office stood beside the post office in a narrow clapboard building, with one corner of its roof sagging under a crust of ice. A red glass lamp hung crooked beside the door. Before Elias had fully stopped the sled, a round man in shirt sleeves and an open buffalo coat came plunging through the snow. "Bellamy," he shouted. Clara climbed down with Noah in her arms. "Clara Bellamy." The man seized her free hand. "Horace Pritchard, postmaster. I have never been so pleased to see a stranger in my life." Pritchard's pleasure lasted until Noah coughed. His expression immediately changed. "Doc Weller is still out at McClellan's place. Their youngest took a fever, and the road south is buried." Clara's grip tightened around the child. "When can he return?" "Could be tonight. Could be tomorrow." Elias stepped between them before worry hardened into panic. "Noah's warmer than yesterday. Breathing's rough, but he's eating." Pritchard looked from Elias to Clara, and appeared to realize for the first time that they had arrived together. "Rourke, I heard your pass station had gone silent." "Nearly did." Elias glanced at the sagging office roof. "Looks like you've been collecting troubles." Pritchard gave a humorless laugh. "Roof leaks over the sorting table, West Battery is weak, and Mrs. Vale says she'll refuse another day of mail sacks in her bakery because they smell of horse." From the doorway behind him, a broad-shouldered woman holding a flour-covered rolling pin called, "I said they smell of wet horse. Horace. Dry horse I might tolerate." Clara blinked. Elias almost smiled. "Pritchard psyched. That is Agnes Vale. She owns the bakery and currently half the town's patients." Agnes looked Clara over, then Noah, then pointed the rolling pin toward a building across the road. "You'll sleep above my shop until that baby has a proper room." No arguing. Clara began work less than an hour after arriving. Elias tried to tell her that surviving 2 nights in a blizzard entitled a person to sit down, but she answered that offices did not reopen themselves. The telegraph room had 1 desk, 2 sounders, a wall map, battery shelves, and a counter worn smooth by years of money orders and elbows. Meltwater had stained the ceiling above the western corner. Clara removed her coat, rolled her sleeves, and immediately began sorting the confusion into categories. Dry forms there, wet forms by the stove not on it, batteries off the floor, messages arranged by date, not by how urgently Mr. Pritchard remembers them. Horace protested from behind a stack of envelopes. "I have a system. You have several systems, fighting each other." Elias, standing on a ladder beneath the leaking ceiling, laughed before he could stop himself. Clara looked up. "You are not exempt. If you drip roof tar on my message ledger, I will bill the county." "Your message ledger? I have been employed for almost 40 minutes. Ownership comes quickly." By noon, the office no longer looked abandoned. Clara's coat hung on a peg behind the desk. Noah's blanket occupied a basket beside the stove. Elias's hammer lay on the sill. None of them remarked on how naturally the room had begun making space for all 3. The first official transmission Clara sent from Hart's Crossing was not about herself. After cleaning the contacts and replacing 2 cells with the dry batteries from the shelter, she called the Eastern Station and requested information on Dr. Weller's route. Then she sent notice that Hart's Crossing had resumed limited service. The response came quickly enough to make Pritchard clap both hands together. Within an hour, townspeople began arriving with messages they had been unable to send. A rancher asking about feed delivery, a widow trying to reach her son in Omaha, a merchant confirming a flour shipment, and the railroad foreman warning that a snowplow would attempt the spur in 2 days. Clara handled them one by one, while bouncing Noah's basket with her boot whenever he stirred. Elias repaired the roof above her and listened to her voice change with each customer, firm with the impatient merchant, gentle with the widow, exact with the railroad man. Competence in the mountains had impressed him. Competence with people unsettled him more. She could turn confusion into order without making those around her feel foolish. When he descended from the ladder, she slid a cup of coffee toward him without interrupting her transmission. It held no sugar. He had never told her he took it that way. By the 3rd day, routines had formed before either of them admitted they existed. Elias arrived from the county shed shortly after dawn, usually carrying split kindling because Agnes Vale complained that the office stove consumed wood faster than Horace consumed gossip. Clara would already have the first battery reading written in the ledger. She learned that Elias preferred the heel of Agnes's bread because it toasted harder. He learned that Clara forgot to eat whenever 3 messages arrived at once, so he began placing something beside her elbow without comment. Noah learned Elias's footsteps. The first time the baby heard his boots on the porch and turned toward the door, Clara pretended not to notice Elias stopping just inside as though struck by a small invisible blow. Their work overlapped constantly. Elias rehung the crooked red signal lamp outside the office. Clara repaired the frayed insulation on the line entering his county shed. He built a narrow shelf beside her desk for spare forms. She labeled his repair tags because, as she put it, "Your handwriting resembles frightened livestock." He replied that frightened livestock was still more readable than railroad accounting. Pritchard declared them both intolerable, and then began finding reasons to leave the room whenever they argued. Not everything worked. Elias's first roof patch failed when midday sun softened the tar and a new freeze pulled the canvas seam apart. Water began dripping over the western message rack again, forcing him to climb back onto the roof under Clara's disapproving stare. Clara's attempt to revive 2 weakened battery jars failed as well. One cracked overnight, spilling acid into a wooden tray and ruining a bundle of spare wire labels. Neither failure became a quarrel because both had learned something during the pass. Elias came down from the roof, admitted he had stretched the canvas too tightly, and rebuilt the patch with slack for contraction. Clara stared at the ruined tray for a long moment, then said, "I tried to save cells that should have been replaced." She ordered fresh jars through the railroad depot instead of wasting another afternoon proving herself clever. That evening they cleaned the acid spill together. Elias sprinkled ashes while Clara scraped the damaged wood. "We are doing excellent work," he said. "You say that while kneeling in battery acid." "I said work. I did not say elegant work." Clara laughed. And Noah, hearing her, laughed too. Dr. Weller finally returned on the 4th evening, frost crusting his mustache and exhaustion turning his eyes red. He examined Noah beside Agnes Vale's kitchen stove while Clara stood so still that Elias could see the effort it cost her. The doctor listened to the child's lungs, checked his throat, then asked several questions about the fever and appetite. "Chest is irritated, but I don't hear pneumonia," he said at last. "Keep him warm. Keep him drinking. If that fever climbs again, send for me." Clara gripped the back of a chair. For 4 days she had moved through blizzard, broken line, office repairs, and official messages with almost mechanical control. That single sentence weakened her knees more effectively than the storm. She sat down abruptly. Elias was beside the doorway, close enough to help and far enough not to embarrass her. Agnes pressed a bowl of stew into Clara's hands. "Eat." Clara obeyed. Later, walking back toward the office, she said, "You knew what the doctor would probably say. I hoped. You didn't tell me." Elias looked across the snow, at the red lamp glowing beside the office door. Hope sounds cruel when it pretends to be certainty. Clara was quiet a moment. "Thank you for not pretending." That night a message arrived from Cheyenne concerning the coming postal inspection. The examiner would reach Hart's Crossing in 9 days, weather permitting. Pritchard groaned. Clara read the telegram twice, then began making a list. Roof sound, money order books, balanced, batteries reliable, line interruptions logged, mail sacks cleared from Agnes's bakery, emergency equipment inventoried. Elias leaned over her shoulder. "You forgot the South Pole section." "I did not forget it. I was hoping it would repair itself out of shame. Poles are stubborn. So are county repairmen." He tapped the paper. "I'll inspect it tomorrow." Clara shook her head. "We'll inspect it. Half those faults are line faults, not structural faults." "Noah?" Agnes already said she would watch him for 2 hours. Elias frowned, but there was little force in it. 4 days earlier, he would have told Clara the pass was his territory. Now he found himself reaching into his coat for Jonah's compass. He placed it on the desk between them. "Then we leave after first light." Clara rested 2 fingers on the brass lid. This time he did not take it back immediately. Outside, Hart's Crossing settled beneath a clear, brutal sky. Chimney smoke rose straight upward. Somewhere at the livery a horse kicked a stallboard. Agnes was singing badly while washing pans. Pritchard snored in the back room with his boots still on. Inside the telegraph office, Noah slept in his basket beneath the new shelf Elias had built. Clara finished the day's ledger, while Elias repaired the handle of her wooden tool case with a strip of leather cut to fit exactly. The red signal lamp shone through the window, coloring the snow outside with a small patch of warmth. Clara glanced toward the compass resting beside her papers. "You know," she said, "most people use these to find places." Elias tightened the final stitch in the leather. "That's generally the purpose. You seem to use yours to make decisions. His hands went still. After a moment he answered, maybe I got tired of trusting where I thought I was. Clara closed the ledger. She did not ask him to explain. She only pushed the compass gently back across the desk toward him. Then tomorrow, she said, we check the direction together. The south line left Hart's crossing behind in less than 20 minutes. Beyond the last stable, the telegraph poles followed a shallow ravine toward an abandoned railroad grade where snow collected in long blue shadows. Elias walked ahead with his ash staff, favoring his left knee only when he thought Clara was not watching. Clara carried the repair satchel and Jonah's brass compass inside her coat. She had refused to leave it on the office desk after Elias handed it to her that morning. You said we check the direction together, she reminded him when he raised an eyebrow. Noah remained with Agnes Vale, wrapped in enough wool to satisfy both Clara and the doctor. And for the first time since the blizzard, there was no child between them, demanding immediate attention. The difference felt unexpectedly intimate. Without Noah's coughing or Pritchard's interruptions, Clara became more conscious of Elias's silence, of the scrape of his boots beside hers, of how naturally he adjusted his pace when the snow deepened. Elias, meanwhile, discovered that he had fewer practical reasons not to speak. That realization made him almost wish for another broken pole. They found one half a mile later. The crossarm had split cleanly near the western insulator, leaving the wire twisted against the pole. Elias studied the damage from below. Ice load, he said. Clara crouched near the base and brushed snow from several small cedar fragments. Maybe. But this crack started before the storm. She held up one piece. The wood along half the break was dark with age. Elias examined it, then looked upward. Rot beneath the bolt. Which means the next two poles may be the same batch. He nodded. And if they are, patching this one buys nothing. Instead of climbing immediately, they walked the next quarter mile and found two more crossarms with the same dark staining around the bolts. Clara sighed. There goes our morning. Elias almost smiled. You sound disappointed. I am. I had scheduled this repair to obey us. There's your mistake. He marked all three poles with red chalk, then turned toward the low ridge beyond them. County Shed has seasoned timber near the old grade. If no one stole it. Clara followed his gaze. A line of rotted trestle posts emerged from the snow like black teeth. Elias's face changed so slightly most people would have missed it. Clara did not. The old grade had not carried a train in 7 years. A newer route crossed farther east, leaving the abandoned trestle to weather beneath sagebrush and snow. As they approached, Elias stopped speaking altogether. The remains were larger than Clara expected. Stone abutments at either end, half a dozen timber piers, and a central span collapsed into the frozen creek below. Somebody had removed the rails long ago, but rusted spikes still protruded from the ties. Near the western abutment stood a county storage shack leaning under the weight of winter. Elias opened it, found 3 usable lengths of cedar crossarm timber, and carried them outside. Clara should have been satisfied. Instead, she was watching the stonework. One block near the base bore several initials scratched into its surface. E.R. was easy to read. Beside it, smaller and rougher, J.R. Elias saw where her eyes had settled. Jonah, he said before she could ask. Clara turned toward him. Elias rested one of the timbers against the wall. My brother. The word sounded ordinary, but his hands had gone rigid around his gloves. Clara touched the compass beneath her coat. This was his. Elias nodded. He scratched those initials when he was 19 and thought, every bridge we built deserved his name. He might have left it there if a gust had not blown loose snow through the trestle and exposed something beneath the nearest pier. A rusted iron plate, bearing the faded stamp, Rourke and Sons Bridge Works. Clara read it without comment. Elias walked toward the creek instead of picking up the timber. Our father started the company, he said. Jonah and I took it over when his lungs failed. We built cattle crossings, wagon bridges, railroad trestles. Nothing grand, but enough that men trusted our measurements. The word trusted seemed to cost him. Clara moved beside him but did not crowd him. Below them, ice covered most of the creek, except for one black ribbon of running water beneath the collapsed span. Elias pointed toward the broken center pier. That one went during the spring thaw of '81. Freight wagon crossed after we closed the bridge. Clara waited. Elias shook his head. That's what I told everyone afterward. He drew a breath that smoked in the cold. Truth was, We had reopened it that morning. My decision. Water had dropped 6 inches overnight. I thought the footing had stabilized. The creak sounded louder once he began talking. Elias stared down at the frozen wreckage as if the accident were still moving beneath it. Jonah argued with me, said the eastern pier had shifted. I told him we'd lose the railroad contract if we kept the crossing shut another day. We inspected the braces. I found no split timber. I told the freight men it was safe. His jaw tightened. First wagon crossed, second crossed. Jonah walked out after them because he still didn't trust the pier. Third wagon reached the center when the foundation rolled. Clara could picture too much from the few details he gave her. Thaw-swollen water, timber cracking, horses screaming, men running toward a bridge already folding beneath them. Elias continued in a flatter voice. Jonah pushed the driver toward the abutment. Driver lived. One horse lived. Jonah went under with the center span. His hand moved toward the compass almost unconsciously, then stopped when he remembered Clara carried it. They found him 2 days later. Compass was still buttoned inside his vest. Clara said nothing for several breaths. Then she asked, "Did you know the pier had moved?" Elias looked at her. I knew he believed it had. "That isn't what I asked." He gave a bitter little nod. "No, I did not know. But I decided his doubt cost more than my confidence." There it was. Not merely grief, Clara understood, but the belief Elias had built his entire second life around. If he trusted himself too much, someone else might pay for it. The pass cabin, the repeated checking, the habit of counting food and inspecting bolts twice, all of it had grown around a dead young man beneath a bridge. Clara moved closer to the abutment. "You were wrong," she said. Elias gave a humorless laugh. "That is one way to describe it." "No, listen to me. You were wrong. You were also not a murderer." His expression hardened. "You didn't stand here that day." "No, but I know what guilt does when it finds an unanswered question." Elias looked at her then, sharply enough that she almost regretted the sentence. Clara opened her coat and removed the brass compass. She placed it in his palm but did not release it immediately. "Jonah disagreed with you," she said, "and he still walked onto the bridge, maybe because he was stubborn. Maybe because he loved you. Maybe because he meant to keep someone safe. You have spent 7 years making his death mean only your mistake. That may not be the whole truth." Elias closed his fingers around the compass. "You have your own version of that sentence." It was not a question. Clara looked away toward the creek. For the first time since she arrived at his cabin, leaving would have been easier than answering. She could have reminded him of the work waiting at the line. Instead, she sat on the stone abutment and brushed snow from the edge beside her. Elias remained standing until she said, "My sister's name was Ruth." The name came softly. She was 4 years younger than me, and better at believing people when they promised things. Clara folded her hands to keep them still. Noah's father, Samuel Bellamy, married her against his family's wishes. He was a freight clerk. Good man. Poor judge of timing. A faint smile appeared and vanished. Ruth died 6 weeks after Noah was born. Fever. By the time the doctor understood what was happening, there was very little to do. Elias sat beside her. Clara continued looking at the ruined trestle. Samuel tried. I should give him that. He worked nights, paid a neighbor woman to keep Noah, but grief made him careless, with everything except the child. Then last October his freight wagon overturned outside Cheyenne. Elias's voice was careful. "And that is when Noah became yours." Clara nodded. "Samuel lived for most of a day. I was operating the Cheyenne line then. They sent for me." Her hands tightened. "He asked me to take Noah. I told him I would. Then he asked me to promise something else." She swallowed. "He asked me not to send the boy to his parents back east. They had rejected Ruth. Samuel believed they would take Noah only to erase her from his life." Clara finally turned toward Elias. "I promised." Her eyes were dry, but the effort behind them was plain. 3 weeks later his parents wrote, "They have money, a real house, servants, schools, everything I cannot give him." I wrote back that Noah was staying with me. "You think that was wrong?" Elias asked. "Some nights." She laughed once without humor. "Especially nights when I am carrying him through a blizzard toward a rented room over a bakery." The admission seemed to embarrass her more than any weakness could. "I keep telling myself I protected Ruth's son. Sometimes I wonder whether I protected a promise because breaking it would have meant admitting love is not always enough." Elias looked down at the compass between his hands. You crossed a mountain in winter to reach paid work that would keep him with you. That is a generous description of nearly freezing him. It is also accurate. Clara started to object, but Elias went on. You turned back when the road was wrong. You accepted shelter. You let the doctor examine him. You have changed plans every time his safety required it. That is not what a person does when protecting pride instead of a child. Clara stared at him. Elias's voice became quieter. You told me yesterday that I use this compass to make decisions. Maybe you do the same with that promise. You keep checking yourself against it because you're afraid wanting Noah means you cannot judge what is best for him. Clara's eyes filled before she could stop them. She hated him a little for noticing so much. She hated herself more for being relieved. And what if one day the compass points somewhere I don't want to go? She asked. Elias turned the brass case over in his hand. Then you follow what is true, not what is easy. He looked toward the initials in the stone. I am beginning to learn there is a difference. They returned to the line repair without mentioning either Jonah or Ruth again. Yet the work felt altered. Elias no longer treated Clara's suggestions as useful surprises. He expected them. Clara no longer watched his injured knee as though he might hide a collapse from her. When he needed to rest, he said so. They replaced the first crossarm together, using a rope sling so Elias could raise the timber without climbing until it was secured. At the second pole, Clara discovered the insulator thread had cracked and replaced it from the shelter stock. At the third, Elias noticed the pole itself had begun to rot beneath the snow line. Rather than pretending they could finish before dark, he marked it for full replacement and said, "We stop here." Clara nodded. It was the sort of decision neither of them would have made easily a week earlier. The line mattered. The inspection mattered. But proving themselves mattered less now. On the walk back, Clara carried Jonah's compass again, this time because Elias handed it to her without ceremony when he needed both hands for the tool sled. They reached Hart's crossing after sunset. Noah was asleep against Agnes Vale's shoulder. One tiny fist tangled in the woman's apron string. Agnes surrendered him reluctantly. He ate twice, complained loudly, and attempted to steal a biscuit. I consider him repaired. Clara pressed her cheek to Noah's hair and closed her eyes. Elias stood by the bakery door, snow melting from his coat. When Clara looked up, the intimacy of the afternoon threatened to become awkward under lamplight. She solved it the way she solved most things. She reached into her coat and held out the brass compass. Elias did not take it immediately. "Keep it tonight," he said. Clara frowned. "Why?" "Because tomorrow we replace that third pole, and I want you checking the bearing." He said it lightly, but both understood what he had actually entrusted to her. Clara closed her fingers around the compass. "Then, tomorrow we check it together." Elias nodded. Behind them, the red telegraph lamp burned steadily above the office door, its light touching the snow between their footprints. The third pole went into the ground before noon, but nothing about the repair felt clean. The frozen earth refused Elias's auger, forcing him and two railroad hands to heat iron rods in a brazier and drive them into the soil until the hole widened enough to take the replacement cedar. Clara stood beside the line with her gloves tucked under one arm, testing continuity every few minutes through a portable sounder. Each time the wire answered with a thin, steady click, the men worked faster. Hart's crossing had 6 days left before the postal examiner arrived. The office roof held. The message books were balanced. Fresh battery jars had reached the depot. The south line, once the new pole was braced, would be stronger than it had been before the blizzard. For the first time since Clara knocked on his cabin door, Elias allowed himself to think they might actually be ahead of trouble. He should have known better. At 11:43, while he tightened the final brace bolt, Clara's sounder stopped in the middle of a transmission from Cheyenne, not weakened, not irregular, dead. She tapped the key twice. Nothing returned. "Elias," she said. He looked down from the ladder and knew from her face that this was not the pole beneath his hands. They followed the wire north until they reached the ridge above town. The break was visible from 50 yards away. One of the older poles had come down, but not from rot or ice. The base had been shattered sideways, as though struck by something heavy. Beneath it lay splintered traces and 2 deep grooves in the snow. "Freight sled," Elias said. Clara crouched beside the tracks. Going too fast. The grooves veered toward the pole, then back toward the road. Whoever had hit it had not stopped. Elias swore under his breath. The wire had snapped completely, one end dragged beneath the snow. How long? Clara asked. If the buried end is intact, 2 hours. And if it isn't? Longer. She glanced toward town. The East Relay expects our inspection traffic by 3. Elias was already cutting damaged wire from the crossarm. Then we give it to them by 3. The confidence in his own voice sounded good for exactly 10 minutes. Then he found the real damage. The freight sled had not merely pulled down one span, it had dragged the wire through 2 more poles, cracking one insulator and twisting nearly 40 yards of line into a kinked mess beneath the drift. Clara looked at the wire, then at him. 3 o'clock is gone. Elias's jaw tightened. Not yet. That was his mistake. He knew it, even before Clara said anything. Instead of accepting the delay and sending a rider to the eastern section house with notice of the failure, Elias tried to save the schedule. He ordered one railroad hand to dig out the buried wire, while the other reset the damaged pole. He climbed the second pole himself despite the swelling that had never fully left his knee. Clara called up, "We need to notify Pritchard before he promises service we cannot deliver." Elias kept working. "If we restore the line before he sends anything, there's nothing to notify. That is not how an office should be run. It is how repair crews work. No, it is how men hide delays, until the delay becomes somebody else's emergency." The words struck close enough to Jonah that Elias almost came down angry. Instead, he tightened the binding wire harder. "I said I can fix it." Clara stared up at him, expression changing from frustration to something worse, recognition. He was no longer solving the problem in front of him. He was fighting an older one. "Elias," she said, quieter now. "You do not have to prove the line can be saved on your timetable." He refused to answer. At 2:15, the temporary splice failed. Elias had joined the broken wire under too much tension, trying to restore the span without replacing a damaged section. He did not want to spend time hauling from town. When one of the railroad men released the come-along, the wire held for 3 seconds and then snapped with a crack like a rifle shot. The loose end whipped across the snow, sliced through Elias's coat sleeve, and struck the latter hard enough to knock him sideways. He hit the ground shoulder first. Clara was beside him almost immediately. "Don't move. I'm fine. You are lying from the snow. Shoulder, not head." She pulled his glove off and made him flex his fingers. He could. His arm hurt, but nothing seemed broken. Clara stood and looked at the failed splice. "Now we have less wire than we had this morning." Elias pushed himself upright. Shame burned hotter than pain. The railroad men politely found other things to inspect. Clara lowered her voice. "You knew that section should have been replaced?" "Yes." "And you tried to save an hour?" "Yes. Why?" He looked at the broken line and said the only answer he had left, "Because I was tired of being the man who closes things." Clara's anger softened, though not entirely. "Then stop making closure mean failure." She turned toward the nearest railroad hand. "Mr. Dugan, take the mare back to town. Tell Pritchard the south line is down until tomorrow at the earliest. Tell him to hold all official traffic and send urgent messages by rider to the east section house." Dugan nodded and started immediately. Elias opened his mouth, but Clara faced him. "You asked me to trust your judgment on the trail. I did. You trusted mine on the line. Do it again." He looked toward the town, then down at the broken wire at his boots. Admitting error once on the frozen creek had been simple compared with this. Here, the mistake had his name on it. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow." Clara's expression did not brighten. There was no victory in being right when the line was dead. She only nodded and began gathering tools. That was somehow more merciful than forgiveness. They returned to Hart's Crossing near dusk and found trouble waiting. Pritchard stood outside the post office with a telegram form in one hand and a face gone pale beneath his mustache. "The examiner changed his route," he said before they reached the porch. "Railroad plow cleared the east spur faster than expected. He may arrive in 3 days, not 6. Clara stopped. Elias felt the news settle like another layer of snow over everything they had not finished. Pritchard continued. "And there's more. Cheyenne sent half a message before the line failed. Something about the winter mail contract being reviewed alongside Red Mesa." Clara's mouth tightened. Red Mesa lay 30 miles east, larger, closer to the main railroad, and eager for the route Hart's Crossing depended on. Did they say why? Couldn't get the rest. Elias stared toward the dead wire running out of town. A damaged pole had now become more than a repair problem. If the examiner reached Hart's Crossing while official traffic could not move, Red Mesa would have the argument it needed. Freight would follow the mail. Merchants would follow freight. Families would follow merchants. That evening, the office filled with voices. The blacksmith wanted to know why county maintenance had failed. The general store owner demanded assurance that his bank draft would go through before the inspection. Agnes Vale silenced both men by slamming a breadboard onto the counter and announcing that shouting had never repaired copper wire in the history of civilization. Clara stood behind the desk with Noah on one hip and gave the town what Elias had failed to give her that afternoon. The truth without decoration. The line is down because a freight sled struck a pole. Our first repair attempt failed. We need replacement wire, 2 insulators, and at least 4 men at daylight. Until then, urgent traffic goes by rider to the East Section house. Someone asked whether the examiner would postpone. I don't know. Someone else asked whether Hart's Crossing would lose the contract. I don't know that either. A murmur moved through the room. Clara raised her voice only slightly. But pretending certainty will not improve our chances. Work might. The room quieted. Elias stood near the stove with his injured arm tucked close to his side and watched what happened next. The blacksmith offered a spool of clean copper wire he had been saving for shop repairs. The livery owner volunteered 2 men and a team. Agnes offered food for the crew. Pritchard produced a crate of ceramic insulators so old he had forgotten they existed. Even the general store owner, after complaining about the cost of losing a day's trade, brought in a lantern and 3 coils of rope. Elias understood something then that should have been obvious from the beginning. He had spent years treating failure as evidence that one man had not prepared enough. Clara treated failure as information to be shared before people chose what to do next. The difference was not softness. It was infrastructure of another kind. A town, like a bridge or a telegraph line, survived because weight traveled through more than one support. He looked at the room and felt almost embarrassed by how long he had lived without seeing it. The next morning they began again. Elias did not climb. His shoulder had stiffened overnight, and Clara refused to let pride turn one injury into 2. Instead, he stayed on the ground, measured replacement wire, directed the liverymen, and inspected each connection before it was raised. Clara worked the portable key from a sled near the base of the ridge. They replaced the damaged span entirely this time. No shortcuts, no overtight splice. At noon, the first test pulse traveled south, vanished, then returned. Clara tapped again. The sounder answered stronger. One of the men cheered. Elias did not. He walked the line one more time from pole to pole, checked tension with his gloved thumb, then said, "Send." Clara's fingers moved over the key. Hart's Crossing back in service. Delay caused by line damage. Official traffic ready. Her message raced east. Less than 2 minutes later, the reply came. She listened. Her expression changed. "What?" Elias asked. Clara kept one hand on the sounder. "The examiner left Red Mesa this morning. When does he reach us?" "Tomorrow afternoon." The men around them stopped celebrating. There was another burst of clicks. Clara translated slowly. Red Mesa filed a petition for transfer of the winter mail route yesterday. They claim Hart's Crossing cannot maintain reliable communication through severe weather. She looked at Elias. They used our outage as evidence. For a moment, the ridge seemed colder than it had during the blizzard. Back at the office, Clara worked until dark compiling outage logs, repair dates, battery records, and every message the town had successfully transmitted since she arrived. Elias built a simple wooden rack for the records because the old cabinet door would not close properly. Neither said much. Noah sat on a quilt beneath the desk, healthy enough now to bang a wooden spool against the floor and make Pritchard wince at every strike. When Clara finally stopped writing, her fingers were stained with ink. "If the examiner comes tomorrow," she said, "we cannot hide any of this." Elias set down the screwdriver. "We shouldn't." She glanced toward him. "Even the failed splice?" "Especially that." The words surprised them both. Elias leaned his good shoulder against the cabinet. "If he asks whether the line failed, we say yes. If he asks whether I made it worse, we say yes. Then we show him what we changed." Clara watched him for a long second. "That sounds expensive for a man who hates being wrong. I've discovered being wrong twice costs more." A knock interrupted them. Horace Pritchard entered carrying a sealed envelope that had arrived by rider from the East Section house before the line came back. "For you, Mrs. Bellamy," he said. Clara frowned. I am not Mrs. Bellamy. Address says Clara Bellamy. He handed it over and left. Clara recognized the handwriting before she broke the seal. Elias saw the blood leave her face as she read. What is it? He asked. She folded the letter once, too carefully. Samuel's parents. Her voice had gone thin. They know where I am. Elias waited. Clara forced herself to continue. They are coming west. They intend to petition for guardianship of Noah. The wooden spool struck the floor again beneath the desk, absurdly cheerful. Clara looked down at the child. Outside, the repaired line clicked steadily through the wall, carrying other people's urgent news across the territory. For the first time since arriving in Hart's Crossing, Clara seemed unable to decide which emergency belonged first. Elias moved closer but did not touch her. When? He asked. She looked back at the letter. They may already be on the train. Clara read Samuel's parents' letter 3 times before folding it small enough to fit inside her coat. The names at the bottom, Edwin and Margaret Bellamy, seemed heavier than the paper deserved. They were not threatening people in the crude sense. The letter was formal, controlled, almost painfully reasonable. They acknowledged Clara's care for Noah. They expressed gratitude that the boy had survived his parents' deaths. They also stated that a child of Samuel Bellamy's blood belonged with his lawful family in Connecticut, where he could have tutors, inheritance, stability, and opportunities Hart's Crossing could never provide. Their train was already moving west. They expected to arrive within 2 days. They will look respectable, Clara said at last. Elias stood by the cabinet, his injured shoulder still stiff beneath his shirt. That usually makes an argument harder. She gave him a tired look. You could pretend otherwise. You told me not to pretend certainty. Noah struck the wooden spool against the floor again. Clara looked down at him. The child grinned. The world, she thought, had a cruel habit of placing enormous decisions beside very small, ordinary sounds. The postal examiner arrived the next afternoon on the snowplow train, 12 hours earlier than Pritchard expected. His name was Martin Hollis, a narrow-faced man in a dark wool coat with spectacles that fogged whenever he entered a warm room. He did not swagger like a federal official from a cheap novel. He apologized for bringing snow onto Clara's floor, asked where he might hang his coat, and immediately requested outage records, money order balances, battery logs, mail volume, and proof that emergency communication had continued during the line failure. Clara's stomach tightened. A hostile examiner would have been easier. Hollis was courteous, exact, and observant. Red Mesa's petition rested in the leather case beneath his arm. Their argument is straightforward, he explained. They have better railroad access and fewer winter interruptions. Pritchard began protesting. Hollis raised one hand. That does not automatically make their petition correct. He looked toward Clara. But neither does local need make a route reliable. I will inspect what you have built, what failed, and how you responded. Elias, standing near the wall, met Clara's eyes. There would be no hiding the failed splice, no hiding anything. For 3 hours, Clara answered questions while Elias showed Hollis repair records. The examiner noticed the fresh crossarm replacements, the new battery cells, and the rebuilt roof patch. He also noticed the gap in service. Your first repair failed? He asked Elias. Yes. Cause? Elias could have blamed damaged material. Instead, he said, I tried to preserve a section that should have been replaced. Hollis looked up from the form. Why? Elias paused. I was trying to save time. And did you? No. Clara watched the exchange carefully. Hollis made a note. What did you change? Replaced the full damaged span, added a ground inspection before tensioning, no climbing by injured crew, and we now notify the office before attempting any repair expected to exceed an hour. Hollis made another note. His expression revealed nothing. Later, when he examined Clara's emergency traffic ledger, he paused over the rider entries sent during the outage. These were your instructions? Yes. So the office continued accepting urgent traffic while the wire was down. Clara nodded. A failed line is not permission for an office to stop thinking. Hollis's eyebrows rose slightly. It was the closest thing to approval he had given all afternoon. By evening, Hart's Crossing knew the examiner was in town, and everyone suddenly remembered a reason to visit the post office. Agnes Vale sent a loaf of bread and loudly insisted it was not bribery, because Hollis had not paid for lunch. The blacksmith came to collect a parcel and mentioned, with theatrical casualness, that the restored telegraph had saved him a 40-mile trip over a missing shipment. The general store owner arrived with 3 outgoing drafts and complained about line delays before adding that no other office within 30 miles knew his accounts as well as Clara did. Hollis listened to everything and wrote almost nothing. Clara suspected that was deliberate. People rehearse those speeches? He asked when the room finally emptied. Not with me, she said. Elias, carrying in wood, added. Agnes does not rehearse. She attacks language at full speed. Hollis almost smiled. Then his attention shifted to the red signal lamp outside the window. Why a red pane? Clara answered. Repair crews can identify the office in heavy snow. White light disappears against blowing weather. Hollis nodded. Keep it lit tonight. Railroad foreman says another system is moving over the pass. That weather report changed the room. Elias stepped outside, studied the sky, and returned 10 minutes later with snow dusting his shoulders. Pressure's falling. He went straight to the map on Clara's wall. Storm will hit from the northwest. Harder than the last one if it keeps building. Hollis asked. How long? Maybe tomorrow night. Maybe sooner. Clara looked toward the telegraph sounder. 3 days of strong service had made its clicking feel permanent again. Now she heard fragility in every pulse. What does that mean for the inspection? Pritchard asked. Hollis closed his notebook. It means I remain until travel is safe. Nobody celebrated. If the storm took the line down while Hollis was physically standing in Hart's Crossing, Red Mesa's petition could become very persuasive. Elias immediately began listing vulnerabilities. The South Ridge, the old cedar poles near Miller Creek, ice buildup at the East Cut, the shallow anchoring near the abandoned grade. Clara added battery temperature, backup cells, lamp oil, message blanks, and messenger routes. Hollis watched them without interruption. When they finished, he said, You two do this often? Argue? Elias asked. Plan. Clara looked at him. Long enough to know the difference. The next morning became preparation rather than inspection. Elias took 4 men to reinforce the weakest line poles with rope stays and temporary braces. He brought the ash testing staff, the repaired signal lantern from the line shelter, and every spare length of sound cedar the county shed could provide. Clara remained at the office, sending weather warnings, clearing non-essential traffic, and instructing the East Section House to confirm receipt of every urgent message before the storm arrived. She also created a duplicate ledger. If the roof goes? Pritchard asked. Then one book survives somewhere else. She gave the copy to Agnes, wrapped in waxed cloth. The bakery owner tucked it inside a flour chest. If this town burns, floods, freezes, and gets trampled by buffalo, your numbers will still be in my kitchen. There are no buffalo in the kitchen. Not yet. Noah, now strong enough to crawl beneath the desk, laughed at Agnes's voice. Clara smiled despite herself. Then the office door opened, and a station porter stepped inside. Mrs. Bellamy? Clara stood slowly. Miss Bellamy. The porter removed his cap. There are 2 passengers from the east asking for you. Edwin Bellamy entered first. He was perhaps 60, tall and spare, with silver hair and a black coat that had been brushed clean, despite the train journey. Margaret followed, smaller, composed, and carrying no more visible emotion than a church portrait. Clara had imagined them as villains, because villains were easier to refuse. Instead, Margaret saw Noah beneath the desk and stopped breathing for a second. Her gloved hand rose to her mouth. Edwin's sternness broke just enough for Clara to recognize Samuel in the shape of his eyes. That is him, Margaret whispered. Clara picked Noah up. The movement was instinctive and perhaps defensive. Margaret noticed. Pain crossed her face, but she did not step closer without permission. May I see him? She asked. Clara hated the question because it was respectful. She had prepared herself to fight arrogance, not grief. Yes, she said. Margaret approached slowly. Noah stared at the stranger, then reached for the silver clasp at her collar. Margaret laughed, and the laugh was so startled and tender that Clara felt suddenly cruel for having hoped these people would be easy to despise. The conversation that followed was worse. Edwin did not threaten to seize Noah. He spoke about Samuel's childhood, the school he had attended, the inheritance already set aside, the cousins waiting in Connecticut. Margaret admitted they had treated Ruth badly. I believed my son was throwing away his future, she said. Then I allowed pride to become distance. By the time I understood the difference, Ruth was dead and Samuel would barely write to us. She looked at Noah. We cannot correct what we did to his parents. We can only decide what we do now. Clara's fingers tightened around the child's blanket. Samuel asked me not to send Noah to you. Edwin's face went still. Margaret closed her eyes. I expected that. Clara had wanted outrage. She received shame instead. Edwin finally said, Samuel had reason to distrust us. He also died believing the people we were then would remain unchanged forever. He met Clara's gaze. You have kept the boy alive. We will not insult you by pretending otherwise, but we believe we can give him a secure future. Clara answered, So do I. No one raised a voice. That made the conflict feel larger. Elias returned near dusk and found Clara alone behind the telegraph counter after the Bellamys had taken rooms at the boarding house. One look at her face told him enough. Bad people? He asked. No, that bad then. Clara exhaled something close to a laugh. They are polite, regretful, wealthy. They love him, or they believe they do. Elias set his gloves on the desk. And you? I love him enough to wonder whether that should matter less than what they can provide. Elias did not answer immediately. Outside, men were fastening shutters. Wind had started moving snow along the street. Do not decide because a storm makes everything feel temporary, he said. Clara looked at him. And when do I decide? After? After what? Elias glanced toward the window. After we survive whatever tomorrow gives us. After Hollis finishes. After you see what life here actually looks like when it isn't trying to kill us every 4 days. Clara smiled faintly. That is not a glowing advertisement for Wyoming. I am not employed by the Territorial Tourism Board. The telegraph began hammering suddenly. Clara turned to the sounder. The message came from the railroad foreman east of town. Snow slide at the upper cut. Plow disabled. Passenger train halted 2 miles beyond Miller Creek. 43 passengers aboard. Fuel limited. Dr. Weller among them, returning from a ranch visit. Elias moved closer as Clara copied. Another message followed before she could speak. One telegraph pole down near the cut. Communication may fail. The storm would arrive fully before midnight. Hollis entered from the back room, already pulling on his coat. Can the train reverse? Clara sent the question. The answer came broken. Track blocked behind by drift. Holding position. Need men. Need lamps. Elias stared at the wall map. The disabled train sat near the same abandoned grade where he and Clara had replaced the rotten crossarms. There's an old service path above Miller Creek, he said. Narrow but passable on foot and sled. Clara understood before he finished. The line shelter. Elias nodded. Coal. Wire. Signal equipment. Hollis asked, Can you reach them? Elias looked toward the strengthening snow. Now, perhaps, in 3 hours, no. Clara was already packing her tool case. Elias stared at her. No, she did not look up. That fallen pole may be between the train and the east relay. If we restore even a temporary circuit, they can coordinate the plow crew. You stay here with Noah. Clara stopped. Across the room, Margaret Bellamy stood in the doorway, having returned for the child's spare blanket. She had heard enough to understand. I can stay with him, she said quietly. Clara froze. Margaret did not reach for Noah. Only if you ask me. The choice cut deeper than the storm outside. Trusting Noah to Margaret felt dangerously close to surrender. Refusing help because of that fear felt dangerously close to pride. Clara looked at Elias. He said nothing. This decision had to be hers. Finally, she knelt beside Noah, kissed his forehead, and handed him to Margaret. He takes milk warm, not hot. He coughs more if he lies flat. If his fever rises, send someone for me only if the road is safe. Margaret's eyes filled. I will do exactly as you say. Outside, the red signal lamp above the office had begun to swing in the wind. Elias checked Jonah's compass and handed it to Clara without being asked. She tucked it into her inner pocket. Pritchard brought rope. Agnes arrived with bread wrapped in cloth. The blacksmith sent 2 men. Hollis surprised everyone by taking a lantern and saying, If I am evaluating winter reliability, I should probably see winter. Elias looked at the group, then toward the dark northwestern sky swallowing the last daylight. The storm was moving faster than predicted. Somewhere beyond Miller Creek, 43 passengers waited in a cold train. Between them and Hart's Crossing stood a broken line, a buried service road, failing light, and the same trestle country where Jonah Rourke had died 7 years earlier. Clara lifted the repaired red lantern from the hook beside the door. "One good connection," she said. Elias opened the compass. "Then we keep it alive." They stepped into the snow before the road disappeared. The storm erased Hart's crossing before they had gone half a mile. Elias led with a rope tied around his waist. The other end looped through Clara's belt and then back to Hollis and the two blacksmith's men behind them. The repaired red lantern swung from Clara's hand, its pane throwing a crimson halo against the snow. Without it, each person became little more than a dark shape in white motion. Elias checked Jonah's compass every 100 yards, not because he doubted the direction, but because landmarks disappeared almost as soon as he recognized them. The telegraph poles served as their second guide. When one vanished beneath drift, Clara counted the intervals until the next should appear. 30 more yards, she shouted over the wind. They found it at 28, near Miller Creek. The service path narrowed between a cut bank and buried willows. Elias stopped and drove his ash staff into the snow. The crust collapsed over empty space. Creek edge shifted, he warned. A week earlier he might have trusted his memory of the path. This time he listened to what the ground was telling him. They moved uphill, slower but safer, following Clara's bearing until the dark outline of the abandoned grade appeared through the storm. The line shelter was nearly buried, but its stovepipe still protruded above the drift. Hollis and the blacksmith's men shoveled, while Elias checked the telegraph wire. The fallen pole lay 50 yards east, snapped at the base, its wire disappearing beneath snow toward the stranded train. Clara opened the shelter, found the coal dry beneath the floor, and lit the stove while Elias retrieved the emergency wire they had inventoried days earlier. The repaired signal lantern was still there too, hanging from its hook with the red pane they had replaced together. Clara stared at it for half a second. "Two lights," she said. Elias understood. "One stays here, one goes to the train." Hollis asked whether they could restore the circuit. Clara examined the broken span. "Not properly, but we do not need properly tonight." She anchored the spare copper wire to the standing pole, stripped its end, and began building another bypass. Elias held the wire clear of the snow while she worked. Their first temporary connection during the journey had lasted nearly 2 days. Tonight they needed perhaps 2 hours. When the sounder inside the shelter gave one faint answering click, Clara smiled despite the wind. "That's breath," she said. "Now let's see if it can speak." The signal from the stranded train came broken and weak. Clara knelt beside the shelter's test box, fingers stiff over the key, while Hollis copied her spoken translation. 43 passengers, one elderly man with chest pain, 2 children becoming dangerously cold. One stove in the rear coach had failed. Coal aboard would last perhaps 4 hours if rationed. The locomotive could not move because its forward truck had been damaged by packed ice and a broken rail joint beneath the drift. Worse, the snowplow attempting to reach them from the east had stalled behind another slide. "Can they walk here?" Hollis asked. Elias shook his head. "Not 43 people. Not in this." Clara tapped a question toward the train. "Do you have rope, axes, hand lanterns?" The answer came, yes. Elias unfolded the old county map stored in the shelter. He traced the abandoned grade with one finger. The same line of earthworks that had once carried freight crossed close to the stalled train before curving toward the shelter. "The old grade is higher than the creek road," he said. "Wind will scour some of it clean." Clara saw the plan forming. "We bring them here in groups. Children and weak passengers first." Hollis looked around the tiny shelter. 43 people cannot fit. They don't have to. The shelter becomes a relay point. They sent instructions by wire while the connection still held. Passengers were to gather blankets, rope themselves in groups of 8, and follow the train conductor west along the old grade until they saw a red signal light. Elias and one blacksmith's man would go halfway with the second lantern and establish a meeting point. Hollis would remain at the shelter with the other man, keep the stove hot, and send returning groups onward toward Hart's Crossing whenever the weather allowed. Clara would stay on the key and coordinate movement. Elias disliked leaving her, but she cut off the argument before it began. If the train cannot see you, the lantern is useless. If the groups cannot hear instructions, the line is useless. We each have work. He looked at her, then nodded. No pride, no performance, just division of responsibility. Before leaving, he handed her Jonah's compass. Clara pushed it back. "You need it." Elias closed her fingers around the brass case. "I know the route to the meeting point. You may need to send someone after me. For one suspended moment, neither moved. Then Clara tucked the compass inside her coat. Come back for it, she said. Elias's expression softened. That sounds dangerously like an order. It is. The first group appeared 25 minutes later, as wavering lanterns beyond the snow. Elias found them roped together, the conductor in front, 4 adults, 2 children wrapped in coats, and Dr. Weller supporting an elderly man who could barely walk. The doctor shouted that the rear coach was losing heat faster than expected. Elias led them toward the red lantern, then sent the conductor back for the next group. The system worked twice. On the third run, the storm produced its final complication. A deep crack rolled through the darkness beneath Elias's boots. The abandoned grade ahead sagged. Snow vanished downward in a sudden sheet, exposing black timber and empty space beneath. Part of the old trestle approach had collapsed where drifting snow concealed the washed-out fill. Elias stopped so abruptly the rope behind him pulled tight. 7 passengers stood 20 yards back. On the other side of the gap, the conductor and another group were stranded with the train behind them. The opening was 12 feet across and widening as loose earth crumbled into Miller Creek. Elias raised his lantern and saw the rotten remains of the old bridge structure below. 7 years collapsed into one instant. Timber breaking, Jonah shouting, a span giving way. His body remembered terror before his mind did. The conductor called across, "Can we jump it?" Elias's answer came harder than the wind. No. Once, years ago, fear of delay had made him reopen. A dangerous crossing. Tonight 43 people could freeze if he refused one. The old temptation returned wearing a different face. Hurry. Decide. Trust yourself. Save time. Elias crouched near the edge, studying the gap. Then he did what Jonah had once begged him to do. He listened to doubt. Nobody crosses until we build it. Behind him, one of the passengers shouted that the children on the train had little heat left. I know, Elias answered. That changes how fast we work. It does not change what will hold a man. He examined the exposed timbers beneath the washout. One old stringer remained solid enough on the upstream side, but it could not carry a group alone. The telegraph line ran across the gap above them. Suddenly, Elias remembered the seasoned cross-armed timber they had left, stacked near the abandoned grade, and the rope stays used to reinforce the poles that morning. Materials planted across days of repair work now lay within reach. He sent 2 men back for them. We build a footspan, he said. 2 stringers, rope handline, 1 person at a time. At the shelter, Clara heard the delay through a brief message carried by a returning passenger because the storm had finally torn their temporary circuit loose. No more telegraph. No direct word from the train. End quote. Hollis saw her glance toward the door. You want to go? Yes, should you? Clara touched the brass compass inside her coat. Her old habit would have answered immediately. Noah was in town. Elias was outside. Therefore she must solve both by moving toward the greater danger. Instead she stopped. Observe. Admit. Adapt. No, she said. Not yet. The shelter had become the only organized point between train and town. Dr. Weller arrived with the elderly passenger and 2 children, and Clara turned immediately to work. She wrapped warmed stones from the stove, rationed coal, marked each group as it arrived, and used the repaired red lantern outside the door as a fixed beacon. Hollis watched her turn chaos into sequence. Red Mesa has a larger station, he said quietly while they waited for the next group. Clara did not look up from the list. Then perhaps they need it. Hollis almost smiled. Reliability is not the absence of failure, Miss Bellamy. It is what remains functioning after failure occurs. Near the washout, Elias and the stranded passengers built under lantern light. The recovered cross-arm timbers became the second support. Rope stays became handrails. An old harness strap from the freight sled repaired days earlier lashed one joint where frozen rope would not bite securely. Elias tested the span himself from the safe edge using the ash pole, and then sent the lightest adult across crawling, not walking. It held. One by one the passengers crossed. The conductor carried a little girl tied against his back. A pregnant woman crossed on hands and knees while 2 men steadied the rope. No one hurried beyond what the bridge allowed. The final group came from the train almost an hour later, bringing the engineer, the fireman, and the remaining coal in canvas sacks. Elias crossed last. Halfway over, the upstream edge gave another foot with a roar of falling snow. The rope jerked. He froze. one knee against timber, and for a heartbeat saw Jonah beneath him instead of black water. Then he heard the conductor shout, "Rourke, stay where you are." It was such an ordinary instruction that it broke the memory's grip. Elias waited. The movement stopped. He shifted his weight exactly where the sound timber remained and crawled the final 6 feet. No heroics, no leap, no dead brother demanding imitation. Just a man choosing to come home. By dawn, all 43 passengers had reached either the shelter or Hart's Crossing. Agnes Vale turned her bakery into a warming room and produced coffee so strong, Hollis claimed it might qualify as industrial fuel. Margaret and Edwin Bellamy carried blankets between the boarding house and post office. Noah slept in Margaret's arms until Clara came through the door, snow crusted to her coat and exhaustion hollowing her face. Margaret rose immediately and offered him back without hesitation. He ate. No fever. He has been furious that we prevented him from chewing a button. Clara took the child and pressed her face against his hair. Something inside her settled not because the Bellamys had become less capable of loving him, but because Margaret had done exactly what Clara asked, and then returned Noah without treating care as ownership. Elias entered 10 minutes later, limping, one sleeve torn, face gray with fatigue. Clara stared at him, then reached inside her coat and held out Jonah's compass. "You came back for it." Elias took the brass case, but instead of pocketing it, he closed her fingers around it again. "Keep it until I stop needing an excuse to see you." Clara laughed through tears she was too tired to hide. Hollis completed his inspection 2 days later. He did not announce the decision with ceremony. He simply placed a signed notice on Clara's desk, stating that Hart's Crossing would retain the winter mail contract, subject to scheduled upgrades in line maintenance and emergency storage. Red Mesa's petition was denied, though Hollis recommended that both stations share storm relay responsibilities, rather than behave as rivals when lives depended on the same railroad. Pritchard read the notice aloud twice. Agnes baked 3 pies and claimed none were celebratory, though one had contract saved, scratched crookedly into the crust. Elias submitted a county request for replacement of the oldest line poles and inspection of every abandoned grade crossing. He included his failed splice in the report. No omission, no excuse. Weeks earlier, that admission would have felt like surrender. Now it felt like sound construction. Edwin Bellamy read Hollis's notice while standing near Clara's counter and said, "This town appears more stable than it first looked." Clara glanced at the ceiling patch. A drop of melted snow chose that exact moment to fall into a bucket. "It is still under development," she said. The question of Noah took longer. Edwin and Margaret did not abandon their desire to know their grandson, and Clara no longer wanted them erased from his life. They agreed to return east without him and begin with letters, visits, and a small trust administered in Noah's name, rather than as leverage over Clara. "Samuel feared we would take the boy and make Ruth disappear," Margaret said before boarding the train. "I would rather spend the rest of my life proving him wrong than win that argument in a courtroom." Clara shook her hand, then surprised them both by embracing her. After the train left, she stood beside Elias on the platform with Noah bundled between them. "I thought choosing him meant choosing against everyone else," she said. Elias looked toward the telegraph wires stretching east. "Lines work better when they connect more than 2 places." Clara gave him a sideways look. "That was almost poetic. Don't repeat it. I have a reputation." She smiled. There was no dramatic declaration, no desperate kiss in the snow. The danger had passed. That was precisely why what came next mattered. By early spring, Elias had moved out of the pass cabin, though he still rode there twice a week for county inspections. He rented the small room behind the telegraph office first, then built an addition when Clara pointed out that 3 adults, a growing child, 2 ledgers, and his repair tools could not reasonably occupy the same 12 feet of wall. They argued over the dimensions. Clara won by producing measurements. Elias retaliated by building her desk exactly 2 inches taller than requested, then lowered it the next day before she could complain. Their courtship, if anyone insisted on calling it that, looked suspiciously like shared meals, repaired hinges, remembered coffee, and Noah learning to fall asleep against Elias's shoulder while telegraph clicks filled the evening. One April night, Clara found Jonah's brass compass hanging beside the office door beneath the red signal lamp. Elias had fixed a small hook for it there. "You're leaving it?" she asked. "I know where I am now," he said. Clara studied him. Important emotions, she had learned, became weaker when people tried to decorate them, so she simply took his hand. Outside, the last snow was melting from Hart's crossing. Water ran beneath the boardwalks, freight wagons returned to the road, and the telegraph wire hummed faintly in the spring wind. The red lamp glowed above the office door, no longer merely an emergency signal but a familiar light travelers looked for when they entered town after dark. Noah stood between Clara and Elias on unsteady legs, gripping one finger from each of them. He took a step, wobbled, and laughed. Clara laughed with him. Elias steadied the boy without lifting him, allowing him to try again. Behind them, Jonah's compass hung open on its hook, the needle trembling, and then settling north. Once it had represented a road Elias could not forgive himself for choosing. Then it became something Clara carried through danger. Now it pointed nowhere they needed to follow. They had already arrived not because a blizzard forced strangers beneath the same roof, and not because one person rescued another, but because afterward, when every road opened again, they kept choosing the same door.